Hi, this is Matt Colvin, just offering a little sneak preview of my Davenant Hall course on Luke and Acts. This course is a practicum in reading the New Testament with attention to its own techniques. And this video is a trailer, a sort of sample of the sort of reading that I want to do with you in my Luke Acts course. How will we unpack the text and disclose its meaning? To demonstrate, I'd like to take a story that is unique to Luke's Gospel. It's not included in Matthew, Mark, or John, and it's the story of Jesus raising the widow's son at Nain. Let me read it to you. It happened on the next day that Jesus went into a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, and a large crowd. And as he was drawing near to the gate of the city, behold, there was being carried out a man who had died, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And there was a sizable crowd with her. And seeing her, the Lord was moved with compassion for her, and said to her, "Do not weep." And he approached and touched the bier, and those who were carrying it stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, be raised." And the corpse sat up and began to speak, and he gave him to his mother. And fear seized everyone, and they glorified God, saying that a great prophet has arisen among us, and that God has visited his people. And this word went out in all Judea concerning him, and to all the surrounding countryside. Well, one of the most illuminating ways to detect the emphases and the aims of the text is to pay close attention to focalization, what narratologists call focalization. It's a crucial aspect of how the Bible tells stories. It's often used by the biblical authors to shape how we think about the action and the characters. It's the equivalent in storytelling of the camera angle or the point of view in a film. And here the camera, if we visualize the scene, it sort of shows us the world from Jesus' perspective. We're looking at things from his shoulder. He's approaching the city of Nain, about 5 miles from Nazareth, where he grew up, and he probably knows the place very well. And with him, we draw near to the gate of the city, and we see the crowds around us and the disciples. And the narrator emphasizes this point of view with his exclamation, "Behold!" We do. So with Jesus, we behold. And what do we see? Pay attention to how the situation unfolds before us in Luke's language. He uses word order to recreate in our mind's eye the same gradual gathering of information that Jesus and his disciples experience. Behold, we see something, but what is it? There was being carried out, so pallbearers, as it were, the first thing we see. A man who had died, so there's been some tragedy, some death. Jesus is thus confronting his old enemy, right? Death, which has come into the world so that he might suffer it himself and thereby defeat it. But the tragedy deepens. The only son of his mother, thus death has cut down a young man and removed at a stroke the entire future and financial support of a bereaved woman. She was a widow, so her livelihood is gone. She's reduced to beggary, gleaning, dependence upon the pitying alms of the community. It's a situation we've seen before in the Bible, in the widow of Zarephath, 1 Kings 17. So this is a situation that we see, looking at it through Jesus' eyes. The son is actually dead, and the mother, being widowed and bereaved of her child, is experiencing a sort of death herself. And the narrator gives us insight into Jesus' reaction to this scene. Seeing her, Jesus was moved with compassion for her, splanknistes. The Greek, as usual, expresses this feeling of compassion using a metaphor about bodily organs. He felt it in his gut, where his intestines were moved, down there, the feeling of discomfort and pity. And so he tells her, "Do not weep." The word here is klaio. It's not a mere shedding of tears. It's the ancient keening, wailing cry that accompanied an ancient funeral, while flutes and professional mourners kept up a din of surrounding noise so that the bereaved, the family who had lost a loved one, would feel free to give vent to their feelings. They wouldn't be embarrassed because there'd be so much other loud noise. Very different from a modern Western funeral, all quietness and somber formality. We've seen Jesus rebuke the noise of mourning before, when he raised Jairus' daughter. Now, if a child had skinned her knee and came wailing to her mother, we might hear the same instruction. Don't cry. Jesus is moved with compassion, and he addresses himself to the emotional pain that death inflicts on a child of God. She hasn't asked for anything. There's no request, just the raw pain expressed in wailing. Jesus doesn't need to be asked. He addresses the need of his own initiative. Do not weep. I will do something about it. And so he does. He touches the bier. Why is this mentioned? Because by Jewish law, a dead body makes unclean anything that it's lying on. The bier or bed for a dead person is being carried by carrying ones, pallbearers, we would call them today. And in ancient Israel, to serve as a pallbearer meant becoming unclean for that day. It wasn't a sin, but because one had had contact with a dead body, or with anything that a dead body was lying on, or a house where a dead body was, then anyone who became unclean in this way would have to take a bath and be unclean until evening. And couldn't go to the temple just till the beginning of the new day. But Jesus pays no attention to this law of uncleanness. He goes right up to the bier that's being transported and he touches it. I think probably not surreptitiously, but very obviously. I picture him and sort of walking up to it and just grabbing hold. A very blatant way. He makes lepers and menstruating women clean. He doesn't contract uncleanness from them or from their clothing. We might call it eucontagion. Jesus' purity is catching. So there's an ordinary procedure, a way things go, a sort of set of etiquette and protocols and rules and ordinary obligations around death. Indeed, it's precisely around death that we have such rules. No job requires more politeness and etiquette and knowledge of procedure than a funeral director. But Jesus stops the pallbearers in their tracks. The bastatzontes estesan. The carrying guys stood still. Are they astonished? Has he miraculously frozen them in their tracks? We're not told. What matters is the result. No more progress toward the tomb today. And then, having stopped the procession, Jesus speaks. Not for him the procedure of Elijah in 1 Kings 17, where the prophet spreads himself out on the child 3 times, nor the method of Elisha in 2 Kings 4, where he lay on the child and put his mouth on his mouth and his eyes on his eyes and his hands on his hands, and he stretched himself out on the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. These Old Testament prophets sort of use maximum bodily contact with the dead. It's a sort of after-death CPR. Jesus has no need of that method. He just speaks. The resurrection command formula. Young man, I say to you, arise. Nainiske solego egeteti. Compare other instances. Luke 8:54. Child, get up. Et pais egedu. John 11:43. Lazarus, come forth. Acts 9:40. Tabitha anastathi. Peter. Above all, Mark 5:41's peek at the Aramaic original of the formula. Talitha kumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. Now, what's funny about all of these utterances is that they involve imperative verbs coupled with vocative nouns or names. They are direct address of a dead person, the last person in the world who might be thought capable of obedience to commands. Yet it is a formula that expects obedience. Who is this that bosses around the dead? Who issues orders to death? It smacks of the same sort of authority with which Jesus commands the winds and the waves when he's in the boat with his disciples. And St. Augustine makes a very interesting observation, his commentary on this passage. He says, Christ, by his miracles of resurrection, demonstrates his power over death in 3 different circumstances. The ruler of the synagogue's daughter is raised while she lies still in the house. The widow of Nain's son while he is being carried out. And Lazarus is called forth when he has been wrapped in grave linens and spices and has already been in the tomb 4 days. But this young man of Nain, once he's raised, Jesus gave him to his mother. It's a restoration of relationship. It's almost as though the story really wants us to think about this young man's death from the perspective of his mother. She's the one whose poverty and loss and widowhood have been inflicted on her by the loss of her one help and stay in this life. So God doesn't rescue humankind as bare individuals. The life of the new creation is a restoration and perfection of human nature in its every aspect. And that includes all the aspects of our individual being, our bodies, minds, emotions, the wiping away of tears, the oblivion of all hurts and pains that we may bear in this life. But it also includes the restoration and perfection of our relationships. God's creative and restoring power aims at making a new Israel, that is, a people, not a mere collection of individuals. And that will mean relationship, though perhaps not marriage and reproduction. The restoration of the dead man to his mother is a powerful symbol of how God, by resurrection, restores our relationships as well. We need to remember the biblical view of children. In the book of Job, we see all his children die at the beginning of the book, and then God blesses him with new children at the end of the book. And we, because we think in terms of modern Western individualism, we look at that and say, but what about the original children? They can't just be replaced. They were individuals, and now they're dead. But that's not what the narrator, or Job, is preeminently concerned with. For Job, and I want to quote from John Levinson, Harvard Divinity School, Jewish Bible scholar. For Job, bereavement of progeny is the functional equivalent of death. The patriarch's restoration inevitably entails his recovery of his 7 sons and his 3 daughters. To us, of course, the loss has not been made good, since these are not the same children who died at the onset of the tale. But that very objection only demonstrates the distance between our individualistic and non-familial construction of personal identity and the highly collective and familial concept that underlies these ancient Israelite narratives. For the epilogue, which speaks of Job's restoration, gives no indication whatsoever that grief about his deceased first set of children impaired his contentment at the time of his own death. The tragedy of the mortality of individuals cannot but attract the attention of the modern reader. The interest of the ancient narrator lies, rather, in the restoration of Job through the return of his family. The widow of Nain, of course, cannot experience a restoration of her family as Job did. If she is to be rescued from her plight, it will need to be by a literal resurrection. But Luke has something else he wants us to notice here. The story of the widow's son is a prolepsis, an anticipation of Jesus' own death. Jesus, too, will be carried out for burial outside Jerusalem. His mother, too, will experience the grief of losing her child. And the scholarly consensus is that Mary is likewise widowed. Joseph is dead by the time of Jesus' crucifixion. He died before his wife. In that case, too, there will be a resurrection. But there is a crucial difference. For the young man of Nain, like Jairus' daughter, like Lazarus, is raised only to resume his normal life, live out his days, and eventually die again. But Jesus is raised with a new sort of life, a body that will never die again. Indeed, in him is the age to come, the resurrection that Martha of Bethany expected at the last day. But it's burst into history in the middle of things, in AD 33. And to this great eruption, the lesser resurrections of Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, and the young man of Nain serve as foretastes. They speak of the power of God who would soon deal with death, finally and forever. They're sneak previews of the eschatological reality that Israel has been waiting for. And that is how all the people understand this raising from the dead. Fear seized them all, or as another translator puts it, trembling gripped all of them. For they, being good Jews, make the eschatological connection. A great prophet has arisen. Perhaps the prophet like Moses, whom God promised in Deuteronomy 18:15. And God has visited his people. The Greek is episkepsato, has checked up on, has inspected his people. It's the same word used in the song of John the Baptist's father Zacharias in Luke 1:68. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, because he has visited episkepsato and redeemed his people, and has raised up for us a horn of salvation by the house of David his son. Both Luke's narrative about the resurrection at Nain and Zacharias' song ultimately go back to Exodus 4:31, where Aaron does miracles in front of the Israelites in Egypt to let them know that God is about to rescue them. So the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel and that he had looked on their affliction, then they bowed their heads and worshipped. That is what it is about ultimately. Raising this woman's son is a way of telling the crowd and the disciples about what God is about to do for Israel. It's a signal to them that Israel's God in the Messiah has come to rescue his people as he did before in the Exodus. And like every miracle, it is a way that Jesus asserts his identity, both his identity as Israel's Messiah and beyond that, his identity as Israel's God. That is why there is fear and trembling. How do I assert this so confidently? Because what immediately follows our passage is the question of John the Baptist, which he asks via his disciples when he's in prison. Are you the coming one, or do we wait for another? And Jesus' response makes clear the significance of his miracles. Jesus answered and said to them, Go and tell John the things you have seen and heard, that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel preached to them. We ought to make the eschatological connection in terms of Israel's story. Hebrews 4:2, speaking about the Israel of old, says that we have had the gospel preached to us just as they had. So, this is Luke's artistry, how he uses focalization, Old Testament allusions, the narrative of Israel, echoes of different stories of the prophets, and ties everything into Israel's eschatological expectation. So we, like Jairus, look to Jesus in expectation that he need only say the word, and we will be healed. We are part of this story now. Luke is written so that we might have certainty of the things that have been done among us. Like the widow of Nain, we too receive from Jesus hope and a future. Thank you. Hope you'll join me for Luke and Acts. Bye-bye.